Dear friends, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the chance to be here and be a part of your conference. I think it's very important that despite all the difficulties, our Greek friends are willing to see the ongoing debt crisis not as an isolated event, but as an episode of the broader geopolitical context. In that sense, when we talk about Greece, we always keep in mind the speeding up global recession, the war in Syria, the wars in Ukraine and Yemen, the deteriorating situation in the South China Sea, the rapid militarization of Europe. These are the links in a chain, as we like to say in Russia. I'm not an analyst, an economist, or a politician. For the last 15 years, I work as a reporter for the Russian national TV. I traveled extensively and covered such major global events as the war in Iraq, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, and the economic crisis which it provoked. All that enables me to develop my own vision of the situation. It might be intuitive, but my intuition fails me only rarely, unfortunately. Yesterday, I interviewed Professor Hudson after his very remarkable presentation here. We talked about the possibility of a major military conflict provoked by the economic misbalances and the growing interstate contradictions which seem to be impossible to hide. Mike said he doesn't see anything new in what's happening. Neither he believes it can drag us into war. I would love to agree with him, but I can't. Right now, at this moment, the city of Donetsk is shelled by the Ukrainian army. This army is being re-equipped and trained by the West, and it is getting ready to crush the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, the two regions of Ukraine where people revolted against the 2014 neo-Nazi oligarchic coup in Kiev. Right now, at this moment, in Poland, NATO is conducting the biggest war games since the end of Cold War. Tanks, missiles, nuclear bombers are sent back to Europe massively to counter the mythical Russian aggression. US Marines are parading 200 meters away from the Russian border with Estonia. It's 700 kilometers from Moscow. Actually, 7-hour drive by car. Tomorrow is June 22nd, which marks the 74th anniversary of the Nazi attack on the USSR. A day of special meaning to all Russians and all citizens of the former Soviet Union. 27 million of my compatriots perished in the war. Not a single family, including my own, escaped this tragic contribution. Again, I'm not an analyst, but intuitively, with all the built-in memories of the previous wars that we have, we feel that something familiar is brewing in the air. The charming landscape and weather here, this magnificent pictures, scenery, and antique beauty shouldn't distract us from that growing anxiety. There's a common perception that the next conflict, if it occurs, should not be nuclear, that the sanity and reason should prevail and prevent the politicians from resorting to the use of atomic weapons. I wouldn't be so sure about that. A civil war in Ukraine, instigated and fueled by the military circles in the West, may quickly explode into a full-scale nuclear war in Europe, taking each and every nation a hostage. We must be frank and honest to ourselves. The lessons of the last World War are either not learned or forgotten. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not the only uncertain value in this complex equation. 2 years ago, I traveled to Damascus. It was at the time when the city was surrounded by al-Nusra and various other terrorist groups. On the way from the airport, we could see tanks engaged in combat, choppers flying over our heads, and smoke rising over the embattled suburbs of Damascus. I went there to see the Grand Mufti of Syria, an old gentleman who lost his son to the terrorist attack, but refused to leave the country and abandon his congregation. I remember us talk about the reasons of the conflict, both ethical and economical. That was from my documentary Planet of Babel. When the camera was off, the Mufti said something I keep thinking about till now. You know what? He sighed and looked at me. You won't expect to hear that from a believer, but I'm not sure if Marx was completely wrong. Next day, the plane took us back to Moscow. We ascended in complete darkness, all lights off, to escape the anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Moscow was calm and quiet, covered with snow. The war is far away. You could have thought there was no war at all. Last year, though, Syria chased us down in Ukraine. Right now, it's not only Syria, but also Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon engulfed in fire. Thousands of Hezbollah fighters and Revolutionary Guards from Iran are being dispatched to Syria, which brings us closer to a big war with not only Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Israel, or Qatar, but also China, Russia, and the United States involved, directly or indirectly. Qatar, but also China, Russia, and, Soon after, for the very same documentary, I came to Greece. I explored the depth of economic crisis here. I talked to ordinary people. I went to the Communist Party headquarters and to the offices of the Golden Dawn in Athens. And everywhere I went, I couldn't stop thinking about what the Mufti told me. Maybe Marx wasn't too wrong. The period of irrational exuberance, as Al Greenspan once called his financial revolution, was obviously over. What seemed to be ahead of Greece looked and smelled like war, either a class war on the streets or a real war on the battlefield. 2 years passed, and this feeling is stronger than ever. Last year, I went to Vietnam. We worked on another story, totally unrelated. What struck me, though, was the mood of the Vietnamese newspapers. Our local producer always had one newspaper with him. On the front page, there were always pictures of tanks and jets and military units conducting training. Sooner or later, there's going to be a war here, the producer, himself a retired officer, told us. We're not afraid, he said. We're skilled warriors. We fought America in the 60s and we fight China for hundreds of years. That very same week, Senator McCain came to Hanoi to sign an agreement on military cooperation with Vietnam, quite obviously aimed at China and its interests. Walking through the Vietnamese museum, where McCain's experience as a prisoner of war is illustrated with his various personal belongings, I again couldn't stop thinking about what the Syrian Mufti told me in Damascus. 3 million Vietnamese died in that war. More than 50,000 young Americans lost their lives. It didn't make the war less attractive or less possible today. Let me remind you that there was no lack in similar gloomy projections at the beginning of the 20th century. The inevitability of war was a popular theme in all global newspapers. Still, the world was incapable of doing anything to avert the catastrophe. Months before the bullets in Sarajevo sent Austria, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, America, and many other countries into bloody turmoil, an interesting idea was expressed by German social democrat Karl Kautsky. Kautsky formulated the concept of ultra-imperialism, the ultimate stage of imperialism, which, as Kautsky believed, should at some point have achieved the total monopolization of control over the global markets and resources. Lenin famously ridiculed Kautsky, claiming that there simply couldn't be one unchallenged center of power, because its existence would contradict the fundamental logic of Marxism, the dialectical unity and struggle of the opposites. We all remember the famous Lenin's quote. Let me read it again. The war of 1914-18 was imperialist on the part of both sides. It was a war for the division of the world, for the partition or repartition of colonies and spheres of influence of finance capital. That brought Lenin to the idea of turning the imperialist war into civil war, into the war between the classes. Back then, such logic proved to be bright and successful, as it led to the miraculous establishment of the USSR, at a time when all imperialist powers were weakened by war or too busy with their internal problems. Is that logic still relevant now? What would Lenin say today? Would he remember Kautsky? The popular perception among the European left today is that Russia and China now are newly emerged capitalist powers, nationalist powers, striving for markets and resources the same way as Germany or United States did a century ago. So, sticking to Lenin's plan, the international left should relax and wait until the class contradictions within Russian or Chinese or European or American societies bring about new Bolsheviks. That may or may not happen. Or when it happens, the world will look like a giant concentration camp. How one is going to wage a class war, in such case, disarmed, powerless, controlled, and manipulated? I dare to say that the more I travel, the more I think that Kautsky was right, and Lenin was not. The ultra-imperialism, which seemed to be a fiction yesterday, became reality. The capitalist aspirations of China or Russia, with all due respect, cannot even nearly be compared to the financial, cultural, scientific, and military superiority of the sole ultra-imperialist entity, the United States of America. If the two major free trade agreements are soon going to be imposed on Europe and Asia, such superiority would be cemented for decades. Such concentration of power and solidified control are totally unique. They are unseen in human history. Never before had one country have the whole planet covered with its military bases. Never before had it the whole world dependent on its technological and scientific patents. Never before had it the whole global flow of information or financial transactions under its direct supervision. The staggering revelations by Edward Snowden showed us clearly all that is far from being a joke or lunacy. This is reality. Back in 2006, when I worked as a correspondent in the US, the international press liked to ramble about the neoconservatives' plan for world domination. Murky and conspiratorial theories were exposed. We learned about the project for the new American century and Dick Cheney's 100% doctrine of full spectrum dominance. It seemed a bit funny to me back then. It doesn't seem funny anymore. Can you imagine what kind of world it will be? What will be your country's, your people's place and role in that world? When I first heard the word neoliberal fascism, it sounded like an exaggeration. It doesn't sound that way anymore. So this is how we should see the growing conflict between the post-socialist China, capitalist Russia, conservative Iran. Yeah, 2 more paragraphs. Left-leaning Latin America and the powers of ultra-imperialism striving to establish the new American century. We should see it as a struggle for the world's future, for the world's diversity, for the world's right to be different, for the alternative reality not dictated by transnational corporations and the totalitarian culture of ultra-imperialism. This struggle makes all differences and contradictions which separate us minor and irrelevant. Not a single country can meet this challenge on its own. Sadly, there is no Soviet Union anymore. China is still very weak militarily. Russia is extremely vulnerable economically. Iran is strangled with the embargo. Brazil or Venezuela or Argentina are on the verge of social upheaval. It looks like the right time to start the new global non-alignment movement, in a sense that we don't want our future to be aligned with ultra-imperialism. We should all be united. All parties and movements, right and left, opposed to ultra-imperialism, should be united. We should focus precisely on what could bring us together, on the fundamental questions that make the war possible, or as some people feel, imminent. Same way as in 1914, same way as in 1939, those questions are strictly economical. They have nothing to do with race, religion, ecology, or sexual equality. Basically, it is the very same cursed question: who controls the means of productivity? Now let me briefly, for a minute, get back to Russia before I finish. Despite the capitalist nature of Russia's economy, we are constantly accused of conspiring to restore the Soviet empire. For your understanding, Russian elite is indeed capitalist. It naturally, biologically rejects all ties and connections to the Soviet heritage. It is quite different, though, if you take a look at the population, which I frequently talk to. Over 60% of Russians would like to see Soviet Union back. Here we're not talking about the sense of national dignity or revanchism. After all the years of brutal reforms associated with robbery and decay, they tend to consciously prefer socialism over the oligarchic system which was imposed on Russia in the 90s. So there's a growing demand, a growing thirst for what I call re-Sovietization. Re-Sovietization. The truth is, and the previous World War showed it very clearly, that you cannot resist the onslaught of imperialism with a capitalist economy. Same is today. You can't stop it on a national level. Since ultra-imperialism is a global project, there should be a countering global project of the same scale and proportions. Let me put it simple. We need another Soviet Union. Anywhere, somewhere. As a Russian, I believe that it can re-emerge in Russia. There's nothing nationalistic in this point of view. Russia is still preserving the ideological, economical, cultural, and military heritage of the USSR. It is not alive in the minds of our oligarchic elite, but it is more than alive in the hearts and minds of our people. I don't mean seniors or pensioners. I'm talking about the people of my age and people younger than me. Not only in Russia, but also in other former Soviet republics. In fact, Russia is still the only country that can pose a military challenge to ultra-imperialism. For that, it would have to change itself, as Boris said. It has to get rid of the ugly neoliberal instincts and practices it acquired in the recent 25 years. It has to nationalize its industries, kick out the oligarchs, and bring back social justice. It has to reformulate the universal vision of the future, the ideology, which would have to be no less attractive to the world than it was in 1917. It's a tremendous challenge. There's still no political party in Russia that may cope with it, but I believe the chance is still here. And personally, I'll be doing my best to make it happen. Thank you.